Welcome, everybody. My name is Luca Caminati. I teach film at Concordia University in Montreal. We're very happy to be here today to talk about Alan OLeary 2019 book published by Mimesis International, The Battle of Algiers. I'm going to chair this presentation, this meeting. So I would like to start by introducing our speakers. Then Alan will give us a sort of short presentation. I think it's a video essay on the film. And then we are going to go around the table, so to speak, and have Catherine, Maria, and Luca pitch their thoughts on the book and on the presentation. So let me introduce the speakers. Alan OLeary has written and edited several books and published many articles, and more recently, video essays on Italian and other cinemas. His study of the influential political film, The Battle of Algiers, was published in 2019 by Mimesis International. Second speaker will be Maria Flood. He's the author of Screening Histories of Violence, France, Algeria, and the Moving Image, published in 2017, and Moonlight, Screening Black Queer Youth, just published in 2021, and has published on political violence in cinema in articles including Torture, in Word and Image, Inhuman Acts, in René and Pontecorvo, which came out in Cinema Journal in 2019, and which I really appreciated reading it when it came out. Then Luca Peretti, who is currently a fellow at Warwick University. Luca Peretti's current project investigates cultural exchange between Europe and North Africa across the Mediterranean and at the end of the colonial era, and features the Battle of Algiers as key case study. He has co-edited volumes on terrorism and cinema and on Pierpaolo Pasolini, and his writing has appeared in venues like Senses of Cinema, the Italianist Film Issue, Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies, Historical Materialism, and many others. And lastly, Catherine O'Rourke is a professor of Italian film and culture at the University of Bristol. Catherine O'Rourke is the author of Stars and Masculinities in Contemporary Italian Cinema, 2014, and co-author of Italian Cinema Audiences, Histories and Memories of Cinema Going in Post-War Italy, published in 2020, and has published widely on Stardom, Performance, and Audiences. So, I would say that we can start with Alan's presentation. Alan, go ahead.
Sure thing. Thanks very much, Luca, and thank you to the other Luca, and to Catherine and to Maria for agreeing to do this event. It's great and very flattering to have you all to discuss this book. I'm also delighted to see so many friends and colleagues attending, and hope we get to hear from them later. What I've decided to do is I've just made, I wouldn't call it a video essay, it's more like a PowerPoint with ideas above its station about the content of the book. So what I'm going to do is just share my screen now in the hope that it'll work well enough, and show it's just over 8 minutes, a presentation that discusses the content of the book as a way of staging the interventions from the rest of the speakers.
In this presentation, I give a brief introduction to the content of my book on the 1966 Italian-Algerian co-production, The Battle of Algiers. I don't need to argue the importance of this famous and influential film about anti-colonial struggle and national liberation. Most viewers agree that the Battle of Algiers has retained its power, and what I've tried to do in the book is to give a complex account of the sources of the film's power. That said, I have not tried to write a celebratory book about the Battle of Algiers. Celebratory accounts of the film sometimes fall into cliché, distilling the film to Wikipedia-isms about the so-called authentic space of the Casbah, the documentary value of realism, and the refusal of, let's say, Hollywood modes in the use of non-professional actors. In the 3 central chapters of the book, I take aim at precisely these 3 clichés. I mean, I also do other things. But in doing so, in taking aim at the cliches, my key exhibit is the coda to the film, when the protagonists of the bulk of the film disappear and are replaced by crowds of extras who reenact popular protests against the French occupation. So in that sense, my book is 130 pages, about 6 minutes of film. The historical Battle of Algiers that took place in 1956-57 was actually a relatively minor affair in the achievement of Algerian independence. But because of the film, this Battle of Algiers has become a lieu de mémoire, a site of memory in which understanding not just of the Algerian independence struggle, but also of anti-colonial struggle as such, has coalesced and is contained. The film's focus on the struggle in Algiers allows a symbolic opposition to be set up between the Kasbah and European city, standing for what Frantz Fanon called the colonial world cut in two. However, the presence of the Kasbah in the film has been overstated in many accounts, and several of the locations we see in the coda are neither Kasbah nor European city. The 1950s housing projects from which the Algerian people emerge as a unity in the coda can then be described as hybrid spaces. And in the chapter, I argue that the film anticipates ideas of third space, familiar from the work of Edward Soya and Homi Bhabha. The hybrid locations shown in the coda speak of how the Battle of Algiers is at once a birth of a nation film and an end of empire film. The in-between interstitial character of the coda and of the locations it contains is precisely what makes the film's celebration of the moment of revolutionary possibility so powerful. The question I ask in this chapter is how a film about the liberation of an African country could be receivable and legible in the colonizing North. The employment of realism by the film was one way of engaging a potentially antagonistic audience. Usually, this aspect of the film is linked to post-Second World War Italian neorealism. But I trace instead the film's debt to cinema of the fascist period in Italy, what Ruth Ben-Ghiat has called Italian fascism's empire cinema. These are films from the 1930s and 40s, made in a choral and realist mode to expedite and celebrate the fascist regime's imperial and colonial projects in Eastern Europe and Africa. In my analysis, I tried to show that the means used by fascist empire cinema to know and to naturalize the colonial scene retains its power to picture post-colonial conditions. Hence, the choral and realist approach of the Battle of Algiers. Now, if this sounds like I'm suggesting that the Battle of Algiers is a kind of Orientalist text, well, I am suggesting just that. But please note that I don't mean this as a criticism. I'm arguing instead for a political cinema that, to adapt Judith Butler, does not represent a pure opposition, a transcendence of contemporary relations of power, but that emerges instead as part of the difficult labor of forging a future from resources inevitably impure. This chapter is concerned with the organisation of time in the Battle of Algiers and with the vision of historical time that emerges from the film. It's the least elegantly formed and clearly argued in the book, but it's my favorite because it seems to me the one that has the richest implications for the discussion of historical cinema. The chapter begins with a description of the complex temporal structure of the Battle of Algiers. I also tried to show that the film captures how the Algerians themselves used time as a rhetorical device. For example, by making a general strike coincide with a key debate at the United Nations. But the bulk of the chapter is devoted to historical reenactment in the film, especially once again in the protests contained in the film's closing minutes. For me, the film reveals how actual historical events were themselves a form of reenactment. What the coda to the Battle of Algiers shows is a self-conscious performance of political and historical agency by the Algerian people. Finally, I tried to demonstrate that the Battle of Algiers is a performative rather than an expressive text. The film doesn't express or illustrate a point or position decided in advance, I argue, but comes to an interpretation of history in the action of its making. And this implies that the crowds of extras seen in the coda and elsewhere in the film are themselves a kind of collective historian, making their own interpretation of history. My book is not intended to be the report of a project of research. It is itself the enactment of an investigation into the sources of the power of the Battle of Algiers. I discovered what I thought about the film by writing the book. I did intend, though, that my account of the sources of the power of the Battle of Algiers should also shed light on the means and capacities of historical and political cinema beyond this individual film, however complex and unique it may be.
Hasta mañana, Rebecca, te quiero tanto, mi vida. Hasta mañana, Rebecca, toda la noche yo voy a cantar.
So that's me. I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you, Luca.
Thank you, Alan. If I may say, as a sort of introduction to the discussion, in fact, quite apropos, yesterday I was at the, I was sitting in this office, but virtually at the Udine Film Forum, where the young postdoc and doctoral students of the Università di Udine always organize a yearly event, which is always a lot of fun and very interesting. But there was a very interesting debate yesterday during a talk about the role of cinema and empire, and specifically the role of cinema as an instrument, if you like, of empire and conquest. Obviously, whatever that debate was originated by, I think it's interesting the fact that such a debate is not settled, in the sense that while we all acknowledge the imbrications of the moving image and the colonial and post-colonial endeavors, the ways in which this happen still have to be investigated. And I think your book does exactly that, and it fits very well into a series of contemporary studies, particularly in the Italian and European context, which of course many of the people here in the audience and amongst the speaker are involved with. That is to say, an attempt at reconstructing a history of Italian anti-colonial moving images that I think it's very important. And I think that your interest in reconstructing the discourse around the film, rather than delving into, as you said in your presentation, into the nuances of the film itself, but the discourse that it generated and the way in which it was read is as important of reading the actual text. Am I allowed to share my screen? I am actually, apparently. So if you don't mind, I wanted to show you a couple of images that I used when a few weeks ago I was in Rome at an event organized by our friend here, Luca Peretti, and his buddy, Damiano Garofalo, in which I was claiming or sort of calling for the creation of a potential Italian anti-colonial film archive. And the question was, well, what should we put in this imaginary anti-colonial film archive? We often talk about Italy's colonial past, but we rarely talk about Italy's anti-colonial past. And only a few scholars, and recently, have been dealing with this. I'm thinking of, for example, of Neelam Shrivastava, your colleague in the UK, and few others. So obviously, the Battle of Algiers sits right at the center of that. Not so much because it was exemplary as a film itself, but precisely for what you said, as a discourse or as a compromise. You use this term in your book. It is at the core of that. And it's interesting to look at the Battle of Algiers, at least for me, in relationship to, say, Pasolini's films that dealt with neocolonialism and post-colonialism in, of course, a very Pasolinian way. But looking at the two ways in which Pontecorvo, for example, and Pasolini deal with issue of decolonization, it's obviously a very interesting exercise. I'm thinking also of less known film, for example, Serra Maestra by Ansano Giannarelli, a wonderful 1968 Brechtian experiment shot in Sardinia, but taking place in the Diagesis in a South American country in which Sardinia is a stand-in for Latin America. But this metaphorical sort of or metonymical experiment is used to the full by Giannarelli. In fact, at the end of the film, the extras that you see here in these pictures break the fourth wall and start speaking Sardinian to the camera and speaking against NATO occupation of Sardinia and military bases. Or, for example, I'm thinking of Gianni Amico's film shot in Brazil at Tropico, in which the Italian filmmaker reuses techniques of Brazilian cinema novo to sort of insert himself into another national cinema. So kind of the opposite of Giannarelli, who brought Latin American to Sardinia. Gianni Amico went to Brazil in order to make a kind of a Rossellini cinema novo experiment in Tropici. The film in Italian is called Tropici. This is the Cuban poster that I found in the Cuban archives when I was there. And the film had been translated in Spanish as Tropico. Another classic example of this anti-colonial Italian filmmaking of the 60s is The Wretched of the Earth or The Dam of the Earth. Both translation have been used. It is the Valentino Orsini bizarre rendition of Fanon. For those of you who have not seen the film, it's difficult to describe, but it's basically the attempt by an Italian filmmaker to reuse footage that a friend of his left him to finish, a friend who was directly involved in the African struggle. These two posters that I found, I think really well explains I don't know how to define it, the structure of feeling that that film generated when it was distributed in Italy. We can talk about this more if you want later. I'm thinking of Schifano's experimental film, for examples, as well, and the way in which Schifano was able to introduce many third world themes in his artwork. But more of this later if anybody is interested to talk about this. What I wanted to say is that I think that it is essential to talk about the Battle of Algiers now more than ever for many reasons. One is the fact that this history is not settled at all. neither the cinematic history nor the actual history of anti-colonial cinema it's settled, and we need to go back to it. And specifically, I think the case of the Battle of Algiers is doubly interesting for us because, for example, the fact that it was an Italian filmmaker involved in an Algerian co-production opened up a world of solidarity that needs to be properly investigated, and that it has been dismissed often as either appropriation or as a form of cultural appropriation. So it seems to me that by engaging with the Battle of Algiers as discourse, we are trying to achieve something that hasn't not been done before. That is to say, to think of this film not for its actual artistic value, which ultimately we don't care, but for his cultural capital and social capital that it carries with it. What I like the most about Alan's book is the fact that the Orientalism of the film is taken as a kind of a starting point for a discussion. And I think it is very important because most of the films I talked about, the one that I just showed, from Giannarelli to Pasolini to anybody else, they all are involved in a form of double articulation of solidarity and Orientalism. The sort of let's call it developmentalism, right? Developmentalism and Orientalism go hand in hand in all of these texts. So accusing the Battle of Algiers of being Orientalist text is at this point quite unproductive, because this is indeed in the text itself. It is part of the mode of almost all of these filmmakers. Taking the idea of Orientalism not as a negative, but as a, let's say, starting point for a conversation, I think it's one of the achievements of this book. I don't know if Maria or Luca wants to go first. Maybe Luca, we said, and then Maria. Is that okay? The floor is yours, Luca.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I want to thank Alan and the other people who organized this event. This is supposed to be also, I think, a festive event. We are launching, we are presenting something that has been in the making for many years. And then because of the pandemics, we couldn't present and happily celebrate with the bottle of champagne in person. So I think we should also think of this as a celebration. Alan and I have been knowing each other for a very long time, I think 14 years, and we've been disagreeing ever since. And I think in a sense, we started to disagree when I was very naive and I didn't know that you're not supposed to disagree with senior colleagues until you get tenure. So in a sense, this mode has remained with us. And I think that he really expects me to disagree, and then I'm going to start with actually two positive comments. The first one going sort of following what Luca was saying. I think that this book is the very demonstration of why the film and how the film is still relevant, resonant, and important today, which is one of the things that Alan discusses at the beginning of the book, why the Battle of Algiers is still resonant, in a sense, because we're still talking about it. So this book is the very demonstration, one of the very demonstrations of that. The other positive comments that I want to make at the beginning is that I think the chapter on location is probably one of the finest piece of scholarship that I read in a very long time. It's a mix of close reading of urban and sociological considerations of history of the city of Algiers, and Alan doesn't really emphasize on this, but I think this is also important. He only mentions this in one note. There is also some ethnography or some on-site explorations, which I think really contribute to how the chapter and the book more in general is shaped. There is a very nice comment by the historian Eric J. Osborne, when he talks about Sicily, his book on mafia, and he says something like, you gotta go there to write something about something. And it's like, Alan went to Algiers in order to write this book. And I think that this is, albeit he doesn't emphasize on this a lot, I think this is also important to note. And the chapter on location really emphasize on this. The idea of the last scene, the coda, as a third space, in a sense, really, it works very well. And Alan O'Leary in this book invites us to go beyond what the filmmakers tells us at the beginning. At the beginning, in a sense, the film tells us that the opposition is between the European city and the Casbah, and Alan is like, well, there's something more, and the something more is the coda, which is another space, it's a third space. And I have a question on this at the end, but I want just to mention, to briefly cite Alan here at the end of this chapter. He explained what the chapter is about. I'm just gonna read the end of it. I want to suggest that the coda, I'm quoting Alan here. I want to suggest that the coda sequence of the battle predicates a viewer invited to join the third space of utopian possibility, a space that emerges in the in-between, in the interstices, or in the liminal. The coda to the Battle of Algiers is just such a space, a beyond to the story narrated in the film, and the threshold to the future for an ideally invigorated spectator poised to leave the cinema. So again, if you just have time to read one chapter, you should read the entire book, but if you have time to just read one chapter, or if you need to assign a chapter in the Battle of Algiers that talk about location, I think that chapter 2 is really amazing. So now I have 4 more comments and a few questions. The first one is about history and context. Alan is less interested in the book, in the questions that we ask as historians. He sets this up since the beginning. There's a very nice sentence that is like, a historian might just ask a question like, but I'm interested in something else. I think that, however, there is some implications in being less interested in history, which of course is fine. And I think that having different perspectives on this film is ideal and amazing. But I think that by being less interested in the history and the context, there is perhaps in the book less consideration of the things that Luca was mentioning just at the beginning. So internationalist solidarity, and more in general, anti-colonialism and third worldism, which are not really the protagonists in a sense of this film. I would also say that there is a conflict, which I hope Alan can help us understand better, between the idea of the film as being a compromise and a commission film. At a certain point, it says, for example, it's a commission test presenting an FNL account, FLN, so the Algerian National Liberation Movement, an FLN account of the events. And the idea that Alan sets forth that the film is an ecology of different entities involved. So I think that this is somehow, I mean, it's perhaps a bit confusing. It's either a commissioned text or an ecology. I'm convinced it's more an ecology, and I think that thinking of it as a commissioned text kind of takes away from the richness of the text itself. But I think that this is one issue of considering less the history and the context on the film. The second comment is about the idea of genre memory that Alan discusses in the film. So as he explains in the introduction video, which by the way, I really enjoyed, I think it was a great introduction to the film. Alan said, discusses the Battle of Algiers as couched, and I'm quoting here, couched in a genre, documentary realism, documentario romanzato, or fictional documentary that has an earlier sources in the colonial cinema of fascism. I think that the comparison that Alan sets here with the film by Janina Benghazi is extremely productive, and that there are some stylistic elements that go from documentary realism under fascism to the Battle of Algiers that we ought to consider. However, I'm wondering, and then from here he passes to the idea of genre memory from using the concept from Miguel Bakhtin, and he says that the idea of genre memory refers to the way in which a genre transmits itself to individual text independently of the volition and even independently of the awareness of individual authors or filmmakers. Now, I don't think that this ultimately works for two reasons. One, it's a very prescriptive way of thinking about genres, and I'm going to present here a counterexample. Therefore, if we ought to adopt these strategies, all spaghetti westerns inherently racist? Definitely not. Some spaghetti westerns are anti-colonial, are third worldist, are extremely leftist. So I think that thinking of genre in such prescriptive way might be more complicated than anything else. And then the other thing is the Battle of Algiers is not just a documentary realist film. It's many other things. It's an action movie. It's a war movie. So how does the genre memory of all these other possible genres that we can think of the Battle of Algiers influence the Battle of Algiers as well? Next two comments, and then I go into the question. The first one is about the North. The word North with a capital N appears over 20 times in the book. I'm not sure I understand completely what Alan means with the North, and we have been having this conversation via emails and in person forever. So we just like sort of, bringing this conversation publicly. I think I have a less prescriptive idea of the North. I think there are many North as there are many South, and the interactions in the book, the interactions between the North and the South are porous. There are exchanges, there are communications, there are flows, and I think that the Battle of Algiers, the film, is the very example of these movements between the North and the South. And as Caminati showed in the introduction, directors from the North went to the South to make films, not always and not necessarily in hegemonic or in a position of power. It's much more complex and complicated. In a sense, the North, which we all hate, although we are embedded in, is also a place of resistance with the capital R and the small r. And I think that the fact that the Battle of Algiers is a film that inherits not just some stylistic features of films on the resistance, but also some ways of fighting. I mean, as we probably all know, Pontecorvo has said many times that more than thinking of realist cinema, of neo-realist cinema, he was thinking of how he fought in the resistance. So what kind of strategies he implies as a fighter more than as a director. I think that that's also something to think about. The last thing about Orientalism, I think I agree too that from now on, we will always have to tackle this issue, think whether or not the Battle of Algiers is Orientalist. And I think this is one of the great values of the book. We now have another important issue to discuss, and whether we agree or not, we will have to take on this. My point of this is just that I don't think it's too important whether I, a 30-something white academic based at the moment in a UK university, think that the film is Orientalist or not. I'm more interested in understanding whether the people who are subjective to the Oriental representation think if the film is Orientalist or not. And there's basically no traces of this. I went back and in the book, I went back and checked the early reviews in Algerian newspapers, and the film was never really perceived as Orientalist. So if the film is Orientalist, I want to hear not from me or not from Alan, in a sense. Not that I think that we should not talk about this. Of course, we should talk. Again, we are here. It's a panel of white people discussing whether or not a film is Orientalist. That's absolutely fine. But ultimately, I think that if we discuss about this, we need to hear other point of views. And I don't think that's really what's happening in the book. So again, I think the provocation, which is not a provocation, it's a very nuanced and refined point, is extremely important, but there is another piece that we need to do that it's missing. Okay, there's a bunch of questions already, but a few direct questions, like more sort of small points and curiosities. The first one, again, about the coda. I'm wondering whether in Marxian terms we can think of the ending as the synthesis, and you can decide, Alan, which one is the thesis and which one is the antithesis, if the European city or the Casbah, or if I'm over-reading it. And I'm also wondering whether now we can do some cross reading of the coda of Call Me By Your Name and the coda of the Battle of Algiers, as, in a sense, the thing that happens after that gives meaning to everything that happens before. Then I really, as you know, I love your way of engaging with the critics, and I just want to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit more on the rhetorical strategy of taking what people have been saying for a long time and trying to sort of contest that, because I think that that's one of the things that in the book works best, and I think that that can actually be a rhetorical strategy that can be employed in other places as well. Thank you. This is all.
Thank you, Luca. Should we go around the table, Alan, first, and then you sort of respond? Okay. Maria, would you like to go now?
Sure. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay, so I have so much to say, and I'm going to try and not go over time. First of all, thank you to Alan for the invite and for everyone for organizing. I really enjoyed reading the book and learned a lot more than I thought I would, in a way. And I found myself on so many points not being able to either fully agree or disagree. I've brought up a few of these in this paper. I ended up writing something and doing a bit of a presentation. It kind of builds on some of the work from that Cinema Journal article that Luca mentioned, but I'll try and move forward. I was really interested to hear what other Luca said about audiences, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about in relation to the Battle of Algiers. Not least because I just did a conversation article and I've got a lot of audience feedback, both private and public, on that article. So I was accused of various things, some of which were valid, some of which felt a bit unfair for a 1,000-word article. The first one was that I viewed the film as a scientific object, neglecting emotion. Another accusation, which I thought was more fair and perhaps situates me as a Northern spectator, was that I had ignored the film's connections and importance for revolutions in the Arab world, which I thought was fair enough. I was also contacted by a number of Algerian academics who said, you know, it's brilliant to see people are still talking about this film. There was a South African woman who remembered watching the film in the 1960s, 1970s, and what it meant for people there. So yeah, just to echo Luca, I think that that question of audiences is something that maybe remains a topic of discovery for the film. So another question I was asked was whether I saw the separation of reason and emotion in the film as problematic from an anti-colonial perspective. So that's kind of an argument I made in that Cinema Journal article. And I think that Alan also mentions in this book as well, that, you know, we get the French are kind of associated with speech and reasons, while the Algerians, most notably in these crowd scenes, are kind of filled with emotion, and that's some of the power of those scenes as well. I was also struck as well by Alan's evocation of the film as a liminal one, and I quote, which exists in the interstices of geographies, genres, and registers. So this third space aspect of the film. So how it exists literally between the European quarter and the Casbah, but also how it envisions a past and a future, an old order and a new. So I think these words capture something essential about the Battle of Algiers, and that's what I like in Alan's book, that we get both sides of this story. So, you know, we have this stylish and charming depiction of Mathieu, which stands alongside a kind of delirious glorification of the Algerian crowd. And I think these contradictions are something we can discuss further in Alan's argument around the Orientalist tropes that exist in the film, which unarguably are there alongside a manifest condemnation of the French colonial enterprise. So I'm not sure how far I fully agree with Alan on the Orientalism issue, particularly around the question of gender, but I'm going to leave this topic to the discussion. I think we can certainly say, though, that the Battle of Algiers poses a series of dichotomies around space, nationality, music, lighting, many other areas. And some of these oppositions, I think, are held in place while others are undermined. So I want to focus in on one of these oppositions, and the one that I mentioned is between French reason and Algerian emotion. So as many critics point out, the French appeared to have reason on their side. There's this quote from scriptwriter Franco Solinas, who says that the colonel is elegant and cultured because Western civilization is neither inelegant nor uncultured. So while we might, as Alan suggests, see the journalist as standing in for this northern spectator, I think Colonel Mathieu also serves this function, and he offers a clear guide through the tactics of both sides. As Alan points out, Algerian characters are not shown perhaps to engage in the same depth of strategic maneuvering. We have Ben Midi and Jafar, obviously, but there's also the lack of speech from the women, the ululations, and Ali Lapointe is, of course, illiterate. However, in that article on torture, I do point out that this speech of the French is shown to have limitations. So we see this most clearly in the kind of euphemisms that are used to describe the torture of Algerians. So I'm looking at two scenes here that come back to back in the film. I won't dwell on this too long, but basically refusing to use the word torture, Colonel Mathieu calls it methods. And he poses this kind of question. So should France stay in Algeria, then you must accept all the consequences. In French, it's actually tous les conséquences nécessaires, so all the necessary consequences. And watching this scene, the northern spectator, should he or she exist, might be tempted to kind of think, well, maybe these consequences aren't that bad. But Pontecorvo, of course, takes us right into a visual depiction of these consequences. And I think that by juxtaposing these scenes, Pontecorvo is clearly saying that when you visualize the kind of end point of this rational speech, it is horrific. Watching another human torture another human is horrendous when rendered visually, and the ethical lines become very blurred. So I've mentioned that after presenting this argument around these two scenes, the separation of reason and emotion, speech and sound in French and Algerian respectively in the film, I think it's fair to ask whether the Battle of Algiers here may be just reenacting another colonial trope. So this is the stereotype that at best the colonized subject is instinctual and emotional, and at worst animalistic and irrational. And Frantz Fanon offers a memorable critique of these fairly commonplace stereotypes in several passages in Black Skin, White Masks. Yet many feminist and critical race theorists have questioned this devaluation of emotion and its relegation to an apolitical or even anti-political sphere. So Linda Ahal describes the ways in which emotions, through their long association with the feminine, have been devalued in politics. So I just quote, emotion is a term that has long been associated with the personal, the body, the feminine. As the constitutive other of reason in Western binary modes of thinking, emotion has been and still is a political category keeping women and the feminine out of politics. So the power of emotion in politics and emotion as political persuasion is profoundly enacted in the work of this documentary filmmaker and activist, Dia Khan, who cites Pontecorvo as one of her inspirations. So Khan has made films about both former jihadis and current neo-Nazis. And as you can see from that quote, emotion is central to her filmmaking practice. So she doesn't seek to engage her subjects on their ideologies, rather she engages them on the level of feeling, describing what racism feels like for her, and secondly, questioning how their beliefs and membership of these groups make them feel. So the success of this approach is striking. 3 of the men that Can interviewed for the documentary on neo-Nazis have now left the organization. One has become an anti-extremist activist and the other is a member of his local African-American church. So to go back to the Battle of Algiers, perhaps it goes too far to say that the Battle of Algiers invites a questioning of what arguably are the embedded patriarchal and colonial histories that have esteemed reason above emotion. Yet, as this kind of third space film, the film might be said to ask why they have to be viewed as oppositional in the first place. So, of course, Ben Meady gets another one of these kind of rational arguments in the film about the disproportionate use of force on the side of the French. We see FLN communiques in the film as well. And we might also think about how Ben Meady's words line up with these images we get also from French victims of the violence. So I would argue that the film shows us that the Algerian revolutionaries combine tactical reason and emotion. And I think the Battle of Algiers recognizes something that's so relevant today, that in times of revolution and immense political change, emotion is a potent intoxicant. So such a reading is supported by US counterterrorism experts who argue that the Battle of Algiers was screened at the Pentagon to show how you can win politically, but lose the battle of hearts and minds. Sorry, how you can win militarily, but lose the battle of hearts and minds. So I think this might be why, or part of why Pontecorvo ends on these crowd scenes. And I love that Alan has focused so much on this coda, which I think has fascinated and enthralled and enlivened so many of us over the years when we watch it. It's hard not to be moved by the spectacle of a crowd. And we can feel fear, as described, I think, by the foreign journalists, or to ecstasy, as represented on the faces of the women, who I was really pleased to see that you pointed out there were 2. That was great to notice. I've only pictured one here. I also was really interested that Alan focused on this image of Black Lives Matter protester Aisha Evans in the book, and I really want to hear more about this. I'd love to discuss how it both connects and is different from those of the women found in the Battle of Algiers. I think there's definitely something around stasis and movement in this image, but it's also to do with the crowd, or an absence of a crowd, as Alan points out. So perhaps now more than ever, I think the last few years have reminded us of the power of the crowd. Is it any wonder that so many crowd formations have emerged after a series of lockdowns which isolated us all in domestic units? So we've seen crowds gather over and over again: anti-vaccine protests, anti-lockdown, Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, feminist vigils. And it's worth noting that over and over again, women are picked out from images of the crowd and turned into icons of protest. I know this is a bit of images of women criticism, but I think it's worth noting. And I think this might suggest that there's something more, or as well as Orientalism, at work in Pontecorvo's use of this kind of iconography. So to conclude, the crowd represents an amplification of emotion, but it also constitutes a political threat. And I think the recent set of draconian laws we've seen in Britain that have been tried to enact on the gathering of crowds really only serves to underline their power. So Hannah Arendt argues that power itself is fundamentally tied to the crowd, where power, quote, is understood as the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. And she goes on to argue that violence as a means of retaining power mostly comes into play when that power is being eroded. Quote, to substitute violence for power can bring victory, but the price is very high. It is paid not only by the vanquished, but it is paid also by the victor. And I think this quote offers a kind of summation of what happened to the French in Algeria. Violence and this use of torture was substituted for political and emotional persuasion, and they lost the group consensus. So this returns me to the images of the women in the Battle of Algiers and the image of Evans. So I think even though she stands alone in confrontation with the police, I think that the power she manifests and that the women manifest more obviously in the film is made legible not only through her defiant stance, but through our knowledge of the context and the ongoing anti-racist protests of Black Lives Matter. So she might stand alone, but she represents the power of the crowd. So that is it from me. Thank you all for listening. Sorry if it was slightly tangential, but the book really got me thinking about lots of different issues, and it's very much some ideas in progress. And yeah, thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Maria. Katrina Rowe.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to read something because I was a bit frazzled this week. So I just kind of wrote it down. Yeah, I'm going to discuss, and thanks, etc. to Alan. I'll just go straight ahead. I'm going to briefly discuss a couple of issues emerging from my reading of the book and also thinking about the film. And these are about my own pet interest, which is the non-professional actor, which I'm writing a book about at the moment. So the fact that Battle of Algiers employs an almost entirely non-professional cast is a kind of touchstone and totem of the film, which is constantly referenced in criticism scholarship, but never, as far as I know, explored in depth. I am not an expert on the production history of the film, but I've asked Alan, and as far as he's aware, there isn't any in-depth engagement with that topic. So if anyone knows of anything, that would be great to know. This, to me, is deeply unsurprising, as questions of acting and performance as core elements of film style have been routinely neglected in film studies until the last few years, as we know. And the use of non-professional actors, bar Jean Martin as Colonel Mathieu, is always cited reflexively as a gesture towards Italian neorealism, of course, authorized through the figure of Pontecorvo and the film's Italian co-production. We might first query the extent to which the automatic critical labeling of these practices as neorealist limits the terms of discussion to the vocabulary of the European canon. I'm quoting Rachel Gabara here in her essay on African neorealism, and whether as praise or critique functions to pull certain films towards that European canon. Not that Battle of Algiers is not, of course, a European film, but that other traditions of performance that actors might be bringing might be occluded by that emphasis. To examine in slightly more detailed casting and performance in the film, so we have one professional actor, Martin, whose performance, as Maria was mentioning and as Alan discusses in the book, is the embodiment of the grotesque rationality of the colonizer. Opposed to this, we have a range of non-professionals that include Sadi Youssef, co-producer and former leader of the FLN, who is reenacting some of his own actions. And then we have figures like Brahim Hajiag, the quote-unquote illiterate peasant cast as Ali Lapointe for his, quote, splendid face. And I'm quoting here from the typically anecdotal biography of Pontecorvo by Bignardi. And then we have a range of extras who have been discussed already, who populate the crowd scenes, who may or may not be recreating moments they themselves participated in a few years earlier. The stories of casting, such as I've been able to find surrounding the film, are extremely typical of the histories of neorealism and also of global art house cinema, featuring non-professionals, which is just anecdotal, unverified, repetitious. The same recurring anecdotes about how Pontecorvo was struck by a particular face, etc., leave little room for consideration of the performance process itself. So how were the actors instructed, or indeed whose voices are being used in post-synchronization? I am not clear on that. It's useful, in my opinion, I think, to bring in here the work of Kate Fortmuller. Sorry, I have to answer the door. It's delivery. I'll be 1 second.
This is what the gig economy is doing to us. It's destroying our beautiful panels. Should I finish?
Like this moment is directed by Hanneke. We don't know what's going to be delivered here, really.
Sorry, it was actually the electricity meter, which I've just sent them away, but there may also be a delivery coming, so I'll be fast. Okay, so yeah, I want to bring in briefly the work of Kate Fortmuller on colonial casting to think about the power relations involved in the contact zone of Algiers, even post-independence. She writes about casting in Boani Junction. The language of discovery, quote unquote, discovery of the non-professional, which is routinely used in these contexts as he or she goes about their business, is itself deeply redolent of colonialism. And the focus on the face or body type aligns with a typecasting that is profoundly political and ideological, as Fortmuller argues. I don't have time to say anything more about this, but it's interesting, I think, for example, that's often repeated that Pontecorvo liked Yasef because supposedly he looked like a bit like Paul Newman, in his opinion, aligning him with the glamour of Hollywood, whereas Brahim Hadjiaj is chosen for a face that presumably speaks to the idea of a kind of essentially heroic Algerian identity forged in sacrifice. And I just said greater attention to all around to the dynamics of performance by scholars on the film might assist in working out some of the ideological values encoded in different performance registers, from bad acting that we can note, and I'm quote unquote bad acting, when non-actors look at the camera, as Alan has pointed out in the book, to Mathieu's constructed speeches, thinking of Karen Lurie's work on the association of proper acting with speech and with the ability to master and deliver complex dialogue convincingly. And I want to make a final point about reenactment, which is a key point that Alan addresses in the book. So his reading of the historical reenactment as illustrating the iterability of the historical event as a continuous performance of history is very persuasive. And he identifies physical reenactment as the communal material thinking of the film, particularly in the quote, meeting of anonymities, that is the coda. And clearly, I think there will be a range of extents to which actors were reenacting events in which they themselves participated bodily. And I find the work of Yvonne Margules on the temporality of reenactment potentially useful here. So what she talks about, the belatedness of reenactment, that makes of the non-actor a disturbing revenant, and how this sort of phantasmatic power of the reenactment is drawn from its ability to highlight the gap between an unrepresentable past and a current approximation of that event, between past reference and present actualization. And the reenactment of past trauma might bring to mind Cesare Zavattini's thoughts on his film about Caterina Rigoglioso, 1952 Storia di Caterina in Amore in Città, when he persuaded a young Sicilian girl to reenact her abandonment of her baby and subsequent arrest, and then express later kind of regret for having, for what had happened, a certain amount of regret. And he said it had been monstrous to make Caterina do this again on camera, presumably speaking to the various meanings of the term monstrous, so unnatural, strange, but also a warning to the future, all of them contained in the etymology of the term. And there's something here, I think, about the sort of temporality of reenactment and the fact that, as we're reminded, actors and non-actors, so whether they're professional or non-professional is what I mean, are always social actors too. And those involved in in-person reenactment are both actors with perhaps limited creative agency and social actors engaged in a representation of the past through their own bodies, which have been deemed appropriately authentic by the director. And the reenactment is its own contradiction, just as Margules argues that, to quote, acting constitutes the aporia of reenactment. And finally, we also need to bear in mind that the non-professionals are not merely the subaltern Algerians. So supposedly the French soldiers and journalists were played by French tourists in Algiers. I'm not sure if that's absolutely true. So we might need to think through some of the questions of the discomfort of the social actor there, and perhaps ask what effort was required for these French citizens, non-actors, to inhabit suddenly this violent colonial mindset and to perform it on film. So yeah, I just finish there. So I think maybe that this focus on non-actors as authentic elements, and even though there hasn't even been much focus on that, but the kind of recurring just gesture to that, has maybe obscured some other questions, which perhaps Alan or some, other people here might have some thoughts on.
Thank you, Catherine. Alan, would you like to respond?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you to all four of you for such rich responses to the book. I mean, you've asked me, would I like to respond? The answer is no. Partly because there's just too much there. I suppose I'll pick out a couple of things to say. I couldn't possibly respond to all of the points that were raised, and even the objections that were raised to some extent to some of the stuff I've done in the book. I think I'd like to defend it qua book, which is to say that it was initially thought of, and here it is, little thing that it is, as part of the BFI Classics series. But it was when they invited a proposal, and then they were changing publishers, so it kind of got lost in the interval between publishers. So it went with a different publisher. So it kind of bears that origin. It became something quite different, but nonetheless, it still has that character. And what the BFI Classics series does is they offer a very strong through line, typically a very strong kind of interpretation of a film, of a classic film, that inevitably will be a little bit crude in its outlines. And I don't really make any apologies for the cruder aspects of the book. I think sometimes you have to wield a truncheon, particularly when you're dealing with, decades of critical prejudice. And when I talk about critical prejudice, what I'm talking about here is both those accounts of the film that are very positive towards it, to the extent that they fall into what I call Wikipedia-isms, cliches in the presentation, and also those negative accounts, which come actually mainly from left-wing critics. So people, there's is it Mike Wayne's book on third cinema, for example, from 2001, where the Battle of Algiers is the bad object. The book starts with a chapter saying why this is not third cinema, and listing all the elements that mean we should not treat it as part of third worldist solidarity, the kind of tradition that both Luca has alluded to in your presentations. So Luca asked me astutely about my method of sort of building to my points through, let's face it, a fairly academic approach of considering the various critical positions so far, and then kind of coming to my own. And it's sort of saying, look, let's try and rescue the film both from the simplifications of its admirers and the condemnations of its critics, because both have not seen it and not listened to it, it seems to me. So, in the end, I agree basically with what Maria was saying. I don't have any objections to what she was saying there at all, except that I would say that what I'm interested in with the film, and I talk about this in the introduction to the book, I want to treat it as popular cinema. I talk about interstitial popular cinema, but the popular is important, I think. That obeys a kind of principle, you could say, of complexity, but I would prefer to say of ambivalence. So it's very much, and again, Ria picked me up on this word, the interstices. So it's in the interstices of also attitudes towards things. So yes, of course, it has a much more complex account of the distinction between reason and emotion than I could do justice to in those moments where I'm putting the emphasis on the consequences of the film's Orientalism. Because what, of course, I'm doing is defending the film's Orientalism. I mean, that's the point. I'm defending it against people like Mike Wayne, who talk about this film as basically not appropriately political from his perspective. Catherine is right to correct me or to say that we need to really think more carefully about the reenactment, the complexities of reenactment and non-professional actors, including, of course, the supposed origins of those who were playing the soldiers and so on. Many of whom, when you look closely at the crowd scenes, seem incredibly young. I mean, some of them seem barely older than 14 or something with their helmets on. But I must admit, I mean, I've said it in the presentation, those moments, and Catherine, I'm really glad that you liked the stuff about the citationality and iterability of history and so on. I was so proud of that stuff. It was when I get all Derridean, and I had to sort of resist it a little bit. But I felt that I was definitely getting at something, and that meant that, of course, then there wasn't space to go into other aspects of the complexity of that situation, of that representation, of that rather reenactment and performance that you get with the protest scenes. So that there is absolutely, and I agree with Catherine, so much more to be said. So I mean, I won't take any more time. I think I just, as I say once again, you know, there's what you can do in a book when you're trying to offer a strong argument that will inevitably sometimes pitch it into the crude. But I think overall, it's what I've been trying to do here is to shift the discourse. And sometimes, as I say, you have to wield a rhetorical truncheon in order to make that happen. You know, I think that's justifiable, or at least I feel it's justified in this case.
Thank you, Alan. Maybe we can try and open up the conversation. Webinars are very unfriendly ways to communicate, but if there is anybody who has a question, I'm asking Line, are we allowed to let people speak, or everything has to be written? I mean, can we allow people to pop up, or is that not possible? Do you know?
I am actually a little bit unsure. I've been looking around a little bit, but you know,
okay,
still right, of course.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have I can still have the option. In any case, if anybody has a comment or a question, you can write it in the chat or the Q&A button. You have two options. So if you have a question for Alan, or a question for any of the speakers, or if you have a comment, or if you want to tell us how much you really like this book, you can do so in written form. And maybe, and I say maybe, we'll maybe be able to let you speak.
Well, there is a raise hand function, I guess. So if someone tries to raise their hand, we can then hopefully enable them to speak.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I hope so. Yeah, absolutely.
Not sure if the function is only for us, though. That might be the case, actually. Cannot speak on webinar, sadly. That's what Dana says.
Dana is saying cannot speak on a webinar, sadly. Thank you, Dana. Yeah. So anyway, that's the way it is. I just wanted to, and please, anybody feel free to jump in at any point. I think that both Catherine and Luca raised the interesting issue, which is the issue of the archives outside of the Europe and North America. And I think one of the reasons why many of the questions that we have been sort of asking ourselves about this film cannot be answered is because there are basically effectively no archives with much left. And I'm pretty sure that I remember Alan telling me that during his trip to Algiers, he was able to find very little in actual physical archive. So a lot of questions about the actors, non-professional actors, in the same way in which Luca P was asking about the response at the time, right? The contemporary response of viewers in Algiers are a little bit difficult to find. Am I right, Alan? Were you going to say something?
Well, first of all, I didn't want to claim any great authority in relation to the materials that might or might not be available in Algiers or in Algeria. I simply wasn't there long enough and didn't get access to enough stuff. I think Luca is going to begin to do some of this work, but what we really need to hear from, of course, are Algerians on this. So, you know, the whole question of the Algerian reception that Luca was referring to, we need much more about that, of course.
Yeah, yeah. And I think,
but I will also mention that there's the Pontecorvo archive in Turin, which David Forgach had looked at for his wonderful article in Nick Harrison's interventions issue from 2007, I think it is, on the film. But I mean, if I didn't find the Pontecorvo archive terribly useful for my purposes. I think for other people's purposes, it would be. There were some extraordinary things in there. Certainly about the aspects of the screenwriting and so on. And other stuff too that I wouldn't have necessarily been alive to because it didn't speak to my interests. So I don't want to overstate, in other words, because I simply don't feel that I'm in a position to assert it that there isn't this archival material available.
Luca, would you like to say something about this?
Just very quickly. No, I think what I meant that the importance that you actually went there is that if you look at the film, like myself, I've never been to Algiers yet for obvious reason, that is COVID. If you look at the film, you might actually think that there is 2 cities in Algiers. And because the third one, it's not so easy to identify. So like a viewer who is not familiar with Algiers, and I think the way you set up at the beginning, how we consider, how we think about the relationship between cinema and cities using J.D. Rhodes. Now the idea that every time there is a film made on a city, the city sort of reinvents itself. So I think that only by going there, in a sense, and having an observational value to the film, the third part becomes, this third space sort of becomes relevant and evident. So I don't know if this makes sense. So in a sense, I think that I understand that you don't want to claim things, but I also think that that part is important and is valuable. And I'm not sure how much your ideas changed when you went there, but I would say that that chapter has an observational tone to it, which you should not understate at all. On the contrary, I think that's extremely important. As for the Cinematheque of Algerian, I think there is people in the chat that might know more than I do, but yeah, it's still hard to access, and it's still quite unclear what there is there about the Casbah film and about the Battle of Algiers, but hopefully in the next few months, this will become clearer.
Mm. Line claims that, Line thinks that she managed to, claim sounds very negative, that if you, but one would like to talk, if you click on the hand button, she would be able to let you jump in. So I'm reading the comment by Clarissa Clo. Clarissa, do you want to speak yourself, or should I just go ahead and read what you said? I'll start reading, and if you want to jump in. Thanks so much for such a thought-provoking presentation. The archive, though, is not just something to be discovered from the past. It is also constantly made and being remade. Contemporary Algerian youth today may continue to engage with it. Absolutely, the idea of the living archive, I think, is essential for, obviously, film studies. It's sad when there isn't one already that can be criticized, though. I love to criticize archives when they're already there and fully cataloged. Alan, there's a question from Dana. Can Alan speak a bit to how the video essay companion material has altered, augmented, varied the reception of the book?
So Dana is talking about the video essay, short video essay on temporalities in the film that I published in Transition in 2018, I think it was, basically while I was finishing the book. Has it altered, augmented, varied the reception of the book? I don't know if I can speak to that. Really, I don't know yet, I think is the answer, except that when in the bad old days, when I was in the UK academic system, this book was submitted to what's called the REF, the Research Excellence, whatever forum, what's it called? I forget. Anyway, it's this assessment of the quality of research in every university department. And the REF report that we got back said, oh yeah, it's a good book, but that video essay is not research. Which is a typical enough sort of response to certain sorts of, let's say, non-voiceover, non-explanatory video essays, which is the case with the one that I published. So I don't know yet. I think that it works as, I envisaged it as a kind of dynamic, illustrative object. And I mean by dynamic that it didn't simply illustrate what was in the book, it sort of spoke back to what was in the book too. And one of the big themes that I tried to tease out in that particular video essay is the Orientalist one. The kind of documentary gaze, or the ethnographic gaze, I suppose you would say, on Algiers itself. But I leave it cryptic, so it's done with a combination of music and images. So I think it's a decent piece of work, but I don't know how it has impacted or influenced the reception of the book as such. No.
You know, that's a very good question, because I actually never thought about it. I always thought of the two as speaking two different languages, and I guess this is also my limitation and many academics' limitation when it comes to videographic essays. There's a question from Manny Sharp. Would you, Manny, like to come up? And if so, press the button. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and read the question. Thanks, Alan. Very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about the writing process? Did the thrust... Oh, there we go. I see Manny appearing. And, but not speaking.
Hello.
Yes. Hi. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Yes. Firstly, thank you, Alan.
Hi, man.
Really amazing event and an amazing book. Really, really interesting. So my question was really about this sense that the Battle of Algiers is a unique film, or a kind of an exemplary film, or even an exceptional film. And whilst I was reading that, I couldn't help thinking of other films that were made during the period, during decolonization, and that represented not only the Algerian War, but the Battle of Algiers itself. Something like Lost Command by Mark Robson, the Canadian director, features Alain Delon as a kind of a paratrooper. So that's, you know, one film that does so, but also something like the Olive Trees of Justice by Jean Pellegrini and James Blue. This is, again, you know, a film that isn't really as well known as the Battle of Algiers, but certainly is kind of saturated with the same ambiguity. It's filmed in Algiers during the war itself, just after the December 1960 riots. And it's also got reenactment in it, but not performed by Algerians, but by the French army, who reenact a bomb disposal operation. So it's really, really similar in many ways to the Battle of Algiers. So that was just a kind of a point rather than a question. Just thinking about how unique this film actually is, you know, if you're comparing it to other examples of kind of late colonial cinema. My question really was about the process of writing, and it was quite a simple question, really, and you can probably see it in the chat. But it was that, well, yeah, I was just wondering how that worked, whether you change your argument throughout writing, and how.
Thanks, Manny, and thanks for coming along. I should say that Manny's my colleague from when I was at Leeds, so it's kind of him to share his expertise actually on the French cinema of Algeria, so to speak. I think I regret now, and I see, you know, kind of got taken away maybe by the rhetoric there at the end of the video presentation I did earlier. I regret speaking about the uniqueness of the film, because this whole thing about it being exceptional, indeed, all this stuff about its resonance and relevance, all of this is a bit of a critical cliche, to be honest. The fact is that the resonance of the film, or the relevance of it, is not universal and is not constant. I mean, I had a very interesting piece of testimony from a colleague here at Aarhus who used to teach in South Africa, and he was saying that at one point his students were deeply engaged with the Battle of Algiers, and it was to do with a particular historical moment in South Africa. When that moment passed, they couldn't care less about it. So it isn't always relevant. It doesn't always resonate, you know. And I guess when I speak of it as unique, what I have in mind is a principle, and this kind of speaks to your second question too, Manny, a principle that I'm not going to treat this film as in terms of what it ought to have been, or, you know, in terms of how it doesn't somehow correspond to the political approach that I think it should have had, or the artistic approach, or the aesthetic approach, or whatever. I'm going to see it as the only film that could have been made at that moment. So a product of its contingencies, in other words. And this guided me in the writing process, because I treated it as I did with in my previous book on the Cine Panettone, these popular Italian films. I treated it as a phenomenon, so a phenomenon to be explained, rather than as, you know, something to be deplored or praised or whatever, but rather as something to be explained in all its then uniqueness. So unique in that sense, not unique in the sense of exceptional, important, and so on. Of course, it is those things precisely for the reason that Luca P pointed out. The fact that we keep talking about it makes it important, you know. And Manny's absolutely right that we should bring to our awareness these other texts that have been occluded really by the fame of this particular one. So it's about, you know, as I say, treating the phenomenon itself as unique, as this product of a set of ecologies. This is the metaphor that Luca P picked up from the introduction to the book, that could only be this thing. So this thing is what we have to explain. So that's what I had in mind there. And in terms of the process, then I tried to be true to that approach throughout, which meant actually that I didn't really know how my argument would evolve. And that's why the book took so long in the end. I mean, particularly chapter 4, which really nearly broke me. But I felt that in the end, I came to an understanding both of my own thought about the film and of the film itself. And as I say, of its uniqueness in the sense of being this contingent product, that was worth the effort, basically.
Yeah, I mean, also the history of afterlives of film is always as interesting as the making of it. And I think, you know, why Lost Command has not entered into the anti-colonial canon, it's a very good question. But obviously, the text itself, I think, had something that others didn't have, that propelled it into this kind of bizarre worldwide, global south, global north afterlife, as it ended up being screened precisely in Cuba, in South Africa, and so on. There's a question from Bukalfa. Bukalfa, would like to, if you would like to come up, press the hand button. Otherwise, I'm gonna go ahead and, oh, there you go. I can see you.
Hello?
Go ahead, Bukalfa.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to ask is, well, I understand Alan's propensity to find a kind of ambivalent, position between this Orientalist, concerning this Orientalist view about the Battle of Algiers, but I believe that there is always a kind of problem when we try to analyze cultures that are, far from us, and that are, or some films or some texts that are culturally perhaps resistant for us. For example, when you speak about ululations, the women's ululations as a kind of Orientalist, bizarre, weird thing, etc. Well, it is in fact, ululations is in fact a kind of expression of pride and a kind of expression of, well, because women ululate in our culture in Algeria when they are happy. So ululating at the death of a martyr, at the death of someone who is very dear to us, is a kind of expression of pride. It is an anti-colonialist practice in itself, because I believe it is a kind of undecidable between. It's a moment of undecidability in the Derridian words. It's a kind of third space in itself. Well, I believe that Alan could have seen this thing instead of just, well, defending Orientalism. Well, that's not really, but he could have, gone deeper into analyzing this cultural practice of ululations. And I'm not speaking only about ululations, but other, cultural things that may seem a bit resistant and, foreign or strange or weird for non-Algerians or foreigners to our culture. Well, another thing that I want to say is concerning, when I read about the Battle of Algiers, I'm really astonished to see the Battle of Algiers becoming a kind of manual for anti-terrorist struggle. I do not believe that Pontecorvo wanted to communicate any ideas about anti-terrorism whatsoever. He was a reader of Fanon and surely influenced by the violent nature of Algerian anti-colonialist struggle. And I was really astonished when I knew that the Battle of Algiers was screened in the Pentagon for the soldiers when they just went to war in Iraq as a kind of manual, to teach them fighting against terrorism. I do not believe that Pontecorvo wanted to communicate any idea about terrorism, because this is Orientalist in itself. This is, I wonder, why do they call Yusuf Saadi or Le Petit Omar or Ali Lapointe terrorists? Why, this is quite American. Why do they call them terrorists? Why they call Mel Gibson a patriot? Okay, he's Mel Gibson who fought, against the colonizer. They call him a patriot, but Yusuf Saadi is called a terrorist. So it's really weird. It's really weird. So what is interesting about the Battle of Algiers is that it portrays this violent nature of Algerian revolution. This violent nature has really inspired the post-structuralist thought. Robert G.C. Young in his White Mythology speaks about that. He says that I believe that the post-structuralist thought, if it is the in White's mythology, he said that if it is the post-structuralist thought is the outcome of one soul historical process, then it is not the riots of Paris in 68, but it is rather the process of decolonization in Algeria, because that's of a very, very violent nature. So, well, this is what I want to say. I do not know if I'm clear now.
Thanks, Boukhalfa, and thank you for calling in from Tizi Ouzou. It's great to have a voice from Algeria at this event. Flattered you make it. Boukhalfa, I know from a visit to Leeds that he made, and also from my visit to Algeria. One thing, I won't comment on the stuff about Robert Young and so on, because it's too broad a theme to dwell on now. I will say that the whole thing about the influence of the Battle of Algiers on both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary groups or institutions or agents has probably been vastly overstated. I read a PhD recently, and I wish to God I could remember where it was written and who wrote it, which had done some better research into this question and corrected, for example, assertions made by me and Neelam Srivastava in a 2009 article where we got stuff wrong. So I think we needn't perhaps worry too much about that. But the question of whether or not I'm Orientalist, because I am analyzing how the whole question of ululation is deployed within the film, well, I would resist that, Wakalfa, with respect. And I'll just read what I say in the book. In the film as a whole, the characteristic sound associated with women is one of wordless ululation. And quote, the jujus of the women, in the word of the script, which revealingly describes them as, quote, dense like the cries of birds, shrill, metallic, angry. So what I'm saying here is not that, of course, within Algerian or Maghrebi culture, that ululation doesn't have a particular connotation and function of celebration, of happiness, of mourning, and so on, but rather that it is deployed in a particular way for a particular set of viewers in this context of the film. So another critic talks about these cries being unearthly to foreign ears and so on. Such cries might seem, and this is me, seem anything but shrill, metallic, angry to a Maghrebi audience to whom they might well connote warmth and community. So that's from the book. So I just want to, as I said, push back a little bit at the accusation of Orientalism in my own interpretation, because I think that's inaccurate.
Thank you, Alan. There's a question from Elena Past. Would you like to press the hand button and come up live so we can all look at the American Academy, or I can read your question if you like. All right, I'm gonna read the question. I don't see Elena. Hello and thanks for the memorable presentations and the book, which I cannot wait to read. Alan, will you say something about your idea of north versus norths plural in relation to souths? I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, of course, this you need to be asking Luca Peretti, who's the person who's been quizzing me on this for years. Apparently this is terminological, right? How do we refer to the West, the North, the global South, the global North, the former colonizer, without presenting these as kind of great blocks, edifices that are not characterized by internal variation. I mean, and you know, there's lots of disagreements and arguments, some of them quite bad-tempered in post-colonial studies about what kind of terminology ought to be used. But then what's post-colonial studies? It's basically a bag of cats in a nest of vipers. You have to use some sort of terminology to make your point. So north is what I went with, but under constant beration from Luca Peretti, I actually put a kind of caveat in the book, which, if you'll permit me, I'll read now. I am well aware that the Battle of Algiers was not only addressed to the colonizing North, and indeed that there were many shades of opinion, including vehement anti-colonial feeling, even in the metropole, and so on and so on and so on. So of course, there are many Norths and many Souths, as Luca P would insist with me every time we speak. But in order to talk, as I do in the book, about what W.E.B. Du Bois called the global color line, that's what I was trying to get at. And that, if you like, is crudely rendered in my book in terms of North and South, global North and global South. Now, of course, these are problematic terms. Of course, they will sometimes lead us analytically astray, but we have to use some sort of terminology, and none of it will ever get us out of jail free. You know, we have to make ourselves understood. However, in the act of making ourselves understood, we misrepresent ourselves.
There's Maria with the hands. Actually, Nicholas Harrison has, do you mind if as a hand up? Nicholas, would you like to come up? Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Alan and everyone. I haven't finished reading the book yet, but I'm very interested in it. And I like your little film as well. People will be studying that in 50 years' time as well, I'm sure. I was actually going to pick up slightly on what Bukalfa said and your response to that, because I liked your way of talking about the film as a phenomenon as well, and not judging it against the standard of what it should have been. It seems slightly slippery in that context to pin Orientalism to what we see on the basis of what critics have written in response to it, or what was in the script. And so, I don't know, I'm going to struggle to kind of articulate this more fully, I think, but there's something about the distance, I suppose, between the representations and the political context and responses, even as we see it as emerging from those. So I was struck as well when you talk about Orientalism in the book, if I understand correctly, part of what you're saying. I mean, I agree with you about the necessary kind of impurity, as it were, of the the aesthetic means available. But part of your justification for that, if I understand correctly, is that it helps it to deliver in a certain way. But it seems to me that with a lot of those images, the ululations or the image of the kind of what you see as a Marianne-like figure waving the flag at the end, so much of that is in the eye of the beholder that it's hard to make that a basis for talking about the Orientalism of the film, rather than of a certain response to the film. And that you've got this a representation that's more ambivalent, more ambiguous, or more plural in its implications than you would surmise from the reactions to it by critics, lots of whom, as you show, are Orientalist. So there's something there. I suppose it connects to with what you're saying about fascism, and I haven't read that part yet. But I mean, I'd say there's someone who quite likes fascist architecture and thinks, does that make me a bad person? But I think there's something in that architecture that isn't fascist, or that has a distance. So perhaps there's a kind of parallel there too. But anyway, I'd be interested in your response to that. But yeah, thank you again for this session and your very interesting work.
Well, I mean, before I answer that, I would say thank you to you, Nick, for your 2007 special issue of Interventions on the film, which is absolutely essential reading for anyone who wants to study it, and also for your article on Islam in the film, which is really important piece of work as well. Yeah, great points, and I'm glad you picked up on what Bukalfa said, because yeah, it has more implications than I was able to deal with in my own over-emphatic response, perhaps. I guess what I would repeat is that I'm talking about, yes, the Battle of Algiers is an ambivalent text, and you repeated that word in the question. So that's one thing. Now, to what extent then am I treating what's in that ambivalent text as it were, essential to the text or characteristic of its reception? Here, and I realize I perhaps didn't resolve this methodologically in the book itself, but it was something I was trying to grope towards. It's about the agency, of the addressee. So obviously there are different addressees, so their agencies will enact a reading of the film differently in different contexts according to who they might be. So the agency here that I'm giving voice to, if you like, is that of I at one point talk about the white male North. So that addressee, if you like, who's enacting their own construction of the film, or I have this notion of the film being constructed in implicit dialogue with that addressee, among others. And then I'm also talking about the agency of Orientalism itself. I mean, if we think, as Edward Said did, of Orientalism as a discourse, that it has this agency, it calls things into being. It's the kind of standard Foucauldian stuff. So it's not so much that these things might be characteristic of the film, although certainly in my cruder moments in my descriptions of it, I will have presented it like that. It's that, this film is Orientalism's way of making Orientalism continue, as it were. So the agency of Orientalism traverses it and changes in that traversal. So that's kind of what I'm after, really. No, that doesn't answer your question. And it's there sort of as a question for me still coming out of the book to try and resolve going forward or to think through further. But thank you very much for that.
Maria, go ahead.
I think Nick expressed it, kind of what I was going to get at in a question. I was going to look at the gender section that you had, Alan, where you evoke a lot of these Algerian images of women to kind of inscribe the film's Orientalism. Yeah, and I guess I wondered if you could talk about that a bit more. So you mentioned how the stasis of Aisha Evans versus the movement of the police is what differentiates that image from the Algerian women who dance. And I wonder if you could say that within that context, actually, that dance, that movement is liberation, a kind of liberation versus Les Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement, where the key thing is that they are static. And you have that Algerian author Assia Jabar, who writes a whole book on Delacroix's painting, and she talks precisely about this issue of movement. And I know we don't want to get too much into kind of images of women, but yeah, that kind of iconography fascinates me. You know, whether Battle of Algiers just captures a kind of iconography of image, and particularly of female, you know, why do we select these women as these figures? Does Battle of Algiers capture that? Has it helped create that? You know, is there an implicit reference to the film when we see these kinds of images reproduced over and over again? And what does it mean, I guess, that these images are not only Orientalist, but they are found, you know, in North or West as well, across the world, really, whenever there is protest. So yeah, I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
I'll just preface my answer by saying we have to finish in 3 minutes, in that we should have finished 12 minutes ago. I'm saying this because I need to leave. Thanks very much for that, Maria. I mean, it's too complex to answer, actually. And what I was trying to do and you're talking about the beginning, the first section in chapter 3. I was trying to navigate these things, and I call on Marina Warner, who's written on, you know, the iconography of women as symbols, to sort of make sense of this. These are undecidables, I think. And that's kind of what I was saying, I suppose, about the Orientalism of the text of the film as well, is that it isn't essentially one thing or another. It just, it's ambivalent, precisely. And which aspect, which face it will show, as it were, will change according to the context it finds itself in, or the set of glasses you bring. I will say that it is very interesting how, and I don't dwell enough on this perhaps in the analysis in the book, but how the particularity of certain locations in the film is dissolved when we get those dancing women at the end. They're filmed first of all from the point of view of the police. So the camera is on the police side. Second of all, they're in shallow focus, relatively speaking, so that the background is obscured by both smoke and soft focus, basically, or a sort of generic kind of location, which isn't identifiable. So they're being distilled to, elevated to, or reduced to, or whatever you want to say, symbol. And particularity is, to some extent at least, been removed from them. And I mean, that's a device. And it's an ambivalent one. So I tried to make sense of it by looking at that photograph of Aisha Evans and why that was so powerful. I also looked at, as you know, because you read the book, at other texts even that have come after it and referred to ones that come before it, in order to see how it navigates that kind of landscape of symbolic representations and, as I say, Orientalism too. Once again, I think I just repeat, we're talking about ambivalence here. It's, you know, it's a talismanic word in post-colonial studies that is now disavowed by many post-colonial writers on post-colonial studies. there's a moment where I talk about in the book about how it had its spotlight moment on the stage of theory some time ago, but it still has this kind of heuristic power, you know, to think of a text as ambivalent, to think of what's in as a text as ambivalent, as having, you know, undecidability built into its very texture. That seems to me still to be something we need to hold on to in our analysis.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, we are 15 minutes past the, well, it's almost lunchtime in Canada. So with that, I'm gonna thank Alan OLeary for presenting his book. I'm gonna thank Maria, Catherine, Luca P, and Line for her help, technical help. I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about this in future occasions, maybe live, who knows. In the meantime, I would like to thank also all the participants and the attendees who stayed with us for almost 2 hours. All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Alan. And I hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you all very much.